one. To start off with, I'm going to talk about the site Çatalhüyük, pronounced word perfect. So this is this week we tested this out on Tuesday, obviously with my Arnside and Cornwall class. And one thing with Çatalhüyük is it's a site of great enigma. And like many sites in Turkey, like Göbekli Tepe, we really don't have all the answers. In fact, much of what we see in archaeology, we don't have answers. Now, this behind me is described as a mother goddess with a lioness and a lioness, either side, more or less as a throne. Now, I know some of you ladies might feel that this might be a great portrayal of them, but no, this is a portrayal of a woman thousands of years ago. Now, the dates for Çatalhüyük are very mixed. And when we talk about very mixed, it's really difficult to try and pinpoint when the people were living initially at the site. Now, what I'd like to do is start off with a little article. And I'm just going to read out, and then we're going to have images behind me. Çatalhüyük. The site itself, people started work there in the 1950s, but it wasn't until the 1960s that Çatalhüyük had a claim to fame. Çatalhüyük could be the site that we see the very early advances in civilization and settlement. It's a site of a mud brick myriad, a massive labyrinth of buildings founded, listen to these dates, over 8,000 years ago. And for the sake of argument, I know one of you complained last week about BCs and BPs and all the rest of it. We'll forget BCs and all the rest of it. Everything will be before present. So any dates I give, the before present is before 1950. So you've got to add 70 years onto any date that I give you, because 1950 is the beginning of before present. And then after that, it's after present. 70 years you've got to add on to whatever dates I give you. I know that sounds confusing, but that's life. What we do see with Çatalhüyük is a site that's been extensively excavated. 1960s, excavations finished because there were some shenanigans with the British archaeologists working there. And then from 1996 all the way through, we've seen excavations offering us a new theoretical, methodological approach to what this site is all about. The archaeologist to think about is a guy by the name of Professor Ian Hodder. And his work has turned up many new and intriguing conundrums. Notably, how on earth was the sizable city organized? Now, I think quite nicely, if you're thinking about how a sizable city is organized, you might think about religion. You might think about kings and queens. You might think about some kind of demos, early democracy, organizing the city. But to date, zero evidence has been found for public buildings or a sense of central authority. We do talk about religion, but then again, in many ways, religion is not always the answer. Added to these theoretical questions comes a glut of gorgeous, intriguing, enigmatic archaeological evidence and a plethora of art in the form of permanent and portable art. Just like this figure behind me. Is this figure behind me a portrayal of a large, overburdened woman, the type of lady you might see wandering the streets of Cowbridge today? Or is it a stylistic, artistic impression of what society wants you to see thousands and thousands of years ago. So when I mentioned the dates of 8,000 years ago, and actually I've got Michael with me. Say hello, Michael.
Hi, girls and boys.
Yeah, Michael's with me. Michael.
Who's Michael?
What do you mean, who's Michael? Michael is my special friend.
Oh, say no more.
No, Michael's been coming here, supporting us, coming up with many suggestions about the lectures from day one. But because he sacrificed the Rhondda class on Tuesday, he's decided to join us today. So that's who Michael is. He's the one who we can be very thankful for helping me keep the ship sailing down the River Styx. Right, that's enough. That's fine. He doesn't need any applause. Thank you. What? Right, 8,000 years ago is an amazing time. However, Ian Hodder has slowly started to find archaeological evidence at this locality of the site not just going to 8,000 years ago, but 9,000 years ago. Paintings on mud brick walls that date back to 9,000 years ago and more. Now, 9,000 years ago, what was happening 9,000 years ago in Britain, for example? Let me think. What was happening 9,000 years ago in Britain, Mike? You haven't got a clue. You obviously haven't learned anything from my lectures. What was happening 9,000 years ago in Britain? Right, most of Britain was still full of trees. Britain itself was still connected to Europe. It hadn't had the early Brexit vote yet, which was unanimous, actually, in the year 8,500 years ago. But there would be another 500 years, 9,000 years ago, before Britain became disconnected from Europe. The numbers of people in Britain were probably the numbers of people that lived at the site of Catalhoyuk. That's how many people lived in Britain. And the one thing I would say is that there's very little evidence of any permanent settlement in Britain at that time. We do have some at Hoyuk, for example, on the Northumberland coastline, and we might be able to look at Starcar. But other than that, 1 second, folks. Ooh. 1 second. Hello, Michelle.
Hello?
Yeah, how can I help?
You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm teaching, yeah. Okay, thank you very much, darling. Love you lots, darling. Bye. You see the affection that I've got for my witch?
She's got a lot of money, has she?
Yeah, she holds all the money, yeah. What's that noise? Right, okay, folks. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird the way things had happening today. Do you know what I mean? It's just I get phone call, then I get phone call. I put the one phone off and I get the other phone. But anyway, talking about Catalhoyuk, I was in a moment then. I was talking about the great age of this site. Now, we need to see some more images. And I have heard, I've got a text on my phone saying, Kathy is sick and tired of seeing my face. She wants to see some artifacts. Okay. Keith, is that an acceptable thing to be saying from Kathy?
Certainly.
I know where your bloody bread's buttered, love. Right, so let's share the screen, darlings. Let's go straight into it. Oh, are you seeing an image, Keithus?
Yes, wall paintings, lovely wall paintings.
Would you believe that this dates back to about 9,000 years ago?
No.
Aurochs, deers, and hunters. Now, what we do have, and I've got the radiocarbon dating evidence, we do actually have radiocarbon dates from this site. Now, if you want to go back a bit in your minds, people, if you can remember thinking about Göbekli Tepe, yeah, we visited the site of Göbekli Tepe, and there was some doubt over the dates with Göbekli Tepe. I was going with the established dates of Göbekli Tepe going back to 12,000 years ago in Turkey. Other people say, no, those dates are wrong. The radiocarbon dates that for Göbekli Tepe are mixed, and they're all over the place. But this site, we've got radiocarbon date, and we've got radiocarbon date, and we've got radiocarbon date. And they all seem to agree that the dates that people are living at this site of Catalhoyuk fix the site at least 8,000 years ago. and the art itself goes back to 9,000 years ago. And some say the art at this locality goes back to 9,500 years ago. So think about it, 9,500 years ago. Ice is still retreating from Britain, from mainland Europe, where Britain was actually still connected with 9,500 years ago. The ice was still melting, but these people were coming within a few years into the prime of civilization. How is it we've got civilization occurring, it would seem, in the middle of nowhere, but it's not in the middle of nowhere? These people themselves are still seeing aurochs within their landscape. And we haven't got the fullness of this image, but what we've got is the back end of an auroch, and we've got a deer, and we've got individuals hunting. Now, we look at this image of individuals hunting and all the other images that you can see here. These might not all be contemporary. Basically, what might have happened, they may have whitewashed the mud brick walls, did a bit of art, didn't like that anymore. The missus is telling me to paint over the wall again, as women do, and you whitewash over that again and you put another design. But what might have happened is that design there, which looks fainter than the ochre on here, that may actually be from an earlier design. Now, one thing that I know Mike would have spotted on Tuesday, if we would have had a class on Tuesday, was that with most art on the planet, we don't see representations of flora. We don't see flowers, and in most art from any period, we don't really see flowers or plant life represented. You might look at the Minoans and something similar, but usually it's animals. Usually it's animals, the odd tree, but usually it's animals. So as we start to get into this, we see these little figures. Now, I can remember when this was very early on, when I think it was sometime around 2007. This was actually on the front cover of Archaeology, Current Archaeology, World Archaeology, and this was on the front cover, and it was associated with our site, Çatalhüyük. I've been calling it Catalhoyuk, haven't I, just to wind up Kathy? Çatalhüyük. So this was actually on the figure, the front of the magazine. This dates to about 9,000 years ago. A piece of portable art. And again, what the archaeologists want us to feel is this is to do with ritual. This is to do with religion. But why do they always have to be to do with religion? I keep saying that in all the seminars we've been doing. They're figures that were created by our human ancestors, like the figure behind me, but they don't necessarily mean to actually need to have a sense of being religious or ritual. And look at this. A seated goddess flanked by two felines, a lioness on either side. I actually like the portrayal of these lionesses. And I used to know a woman who ended up getting pregnant, who became as large as this woman and looked like this woman. And I didn't actually ever tell her that she looked like this woman, but she did. And to be honest with you, this is actually quite a realistic portrayal of a woman. Why does it actually need to be a fertility goddess? And they say it's definitely a goddess. It doesn't need to be definitely anything. So hopefully down the line, we've started to see that there is much more to the archaeology than just religion and ritual. When archaeologists don't know what a thing is, they're definitely religious and ritualistic. I love this clay figurine, at least 8,000 years old. It looks very good. And I like those well-proportioned breasts. And I do like the other representations of the body. Now, what we've been seeing with Çatalhüyük is two phases. The first phase, where we see the excavations in the 1960s, the excavations are shut down by the Turkish authorities. Then we see the excavations from 1996, and they're sort of still going on. What we do see is that the layers at Çatalhüyük are not single-tier layers of archaeology. There are at least 18 layers of archaeological evidence at Çatalhüyük. Now, you might be asking the question, let's just move on a bit. Where in the world does this world come from? Now, what do I mean by that? How did these people start building all these buildings close together in a sort of a labyrinth of buildings? In fact, it's not a labyrinth at all, because they had flat roofs, basically the street and communication, and beehives and animals and whatever hang around on the tops of the buildings. There's no doorways between the buildings. They're just a square in the ground. That's where people live, maybe a few divisions, and they get access to it from a ladder from the roof, and then that's where everything's going. That's where community goes on within the roof space. So the two questions are as follows. Where do we suddenly see this civilization 8,000, 9,000 years ago? Why does it suddenly happen? And secondly, surely there must be evidence of central organization, which there isn't. And there's two answers to that. There must be other evidence to say that people are developing and living like this maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500 years before, starting to build early settlements. So that brings us into the period of Göbekli Tepe, around 12,000 years ago. People must have started learning to live together in communities without central authority. You might think that that's nonsense, but it's not. Look at communism. Communism is supposed to work without central authority. I know you're going to say that's not actually true, but this is how Karl Marx would say. Communism is for the people, by the people, ruled by the people, and all that nonsense. I'm not of that type of thinking. However, it worked. Back then, communism was supposed to work. It didn't. But for these people, in a community sense, if you want to call this early communism, worked for thousands of years. And this is how communism should be. There's evidence to say that everyone was equal within this society. There was no sense of hierarchy. Everyone was equal trade-wise. Wealth was distributed equally. Karl Marx didn't know any of this, but if he did, there you go. It's evidence to say that communism in the late 1800s into the 1900s could work. But these had secrets that we haven't even been able to learn yet. So that's basically the 2 points answered. So but the other thing as well is this is one phase of building. There are 18 levels of building which go meters and meters into the earth. Look at this art. Look at the way this is formed and founded. So you can actually see two wader birds there. And that very much, the one on the left, if we want to look. So you've got these wader birds. Now you've got charcoal, you've got like a manganese type of oxide. You've got an iron oxide here, and you've got these wonderful pastel colors as well. And you've also got this whitewash. Obviously, these colors are not as radiant as they were, and they may have added greens to them. They may have had a green, a pestle and mortar type created green. With a bit of egg white in it, and that may have given a hue of green, and you may have had blues on there, but that's all gone because it's organic. It's deteriorated. We've got evidence of that at some other sites as well, so we can think that they may have actually had blues and greens and so on. And as we sort of go back again, we're looking at the excavations now. What they're seeing, instead of the excavations, these are from the 1960s without a roof on it, which they need to protect these a little bit more. This is the archaeology being excavated today. The Turkish authorities and the universities in Britain are putting a lot of money into doing really delicate excavations, not the rapid excavations from the 1960s. And I'm not really sure I'm even fair in saying that. But what they're doing, they're seeing layer after layer of building. Basically, they built the settlement in the likes of a towel. So you'd have had one settlement at the lowest level, building walls. Maybe those walls remained and they built on top of it. Maybe they pushed more stuff into the middle. They buried their loved ones in the middle of the buildings, by the way. So the burials are actually inside the buildings. Or you could think in some cases where I know, have you ever built a garage, Mike, where there's been a garage there, foundation walls, knocking the walls into the middle, and you've built a wall off it like that? You haven't done that? Well, I have. And you actually see evidence that you've got an earlier building, you level it all into the middle. That's giving you a packed hardcore, and then you build up from it, right? So this is what we're seeing here. But these people knew what to do. They knew how to build. They knew civilization. They knew where they were going. And that's where we're going to go now. So again, these walls, you can actually see the mud brick layers. Now, and you can actually see this sort of rendering on the outside. It's a bit of a shame now that what happened, there was a dispute between the British archaeologists and Turkish authorities. He basically was discovered as taking one or two things away from the site that he shouldn't have, which is very, very naughty. All archaeologists are honest, as we well know. And I know for well, when Kathy was excavating and on a Roman site, she kept one or two of the shells. But that's because she managed to sneak them off the site, little snail shells. Oh, that's blasphemy, Kathy. I don't mean that at all. But anyway, the excavation's finished, and the whole point of what I'm talking about is that the site was allowed to decay, which is a bit of a shame, which is not good. I've heard lots of disputes like that. So this is known as the Fertile Crescent in the area of the Levant. And let's point a few things out to you people. There it is, Catalhoyuk or Çatalhüyük, and Tepe. There it is. We've already done that 12,000 years ago. You look at Jericho, excavated by the likes of the very eminent Kathleen Kenyon. We look at other sites that we have not come across close to this fertile area between the Tigris and Euphrates. The other thing that could actually be said is this site as well, Shanindar. Now, Shanindar is a site that tells us and projects another period in time as well. Shanindar is where we get early evidence of Neanderthals as well. But Shanindar, people were living at Shanindar 10,000 years ago. So you start to think that maybe if we're looking at evolution and we're seeing people developing towns, villages, and sort of cosmopolitan urban areas, it's based back to trial and error going back thousands of years. When you think about it, you look at the Caucasus region where you've got the most earliest evidence of cultivated vines going back tens of thousands of years. So everything's going on within this area. The first, you've got emmer wheat and you've got einkorn being developed as staple cereal crops in a way. Everything's developing in this area, and the intriguing thing is when you look at this chart is this: the earliest civilizations do not seem to evolve around river systems, even though river systems are massively important to these earlier civilizations. But what they've got is access to the sea and access to other waterways, which are not as dependent upon as the Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians would have been upon these massive river systems. As we saw with the likes of Karnak last week, you've got a developed world, and it's sort of set inland, but it's alongside the sea, and so on and so on. Water is important to these worlds, but other things are going on as well. Again, this is a wonderful crescent. This is so tell of much of what we are in modern day civilization. So we're thinking about all of these sites. 2 points need to make now. All of these sites. This, if you look at the top of the chart, and if we sort of zoom out a minute, let's zoom out, baby. If we zoom out, hang on, zooming out. Thank you. If we zoom out from this, we've got that date, 7,500 years BC. So we weren't doing BCs. So this is what the landscape looked like. If you want to add 2 plus 2 on the 7, it's saying that this is what the civilized world looked like 9,500 years ago. So Catalhoyuk's developing. It's not in its prime until 9,000 years ago. We're looking at Göbekli Tepe. We're looking at 1 or 2 other massive sites down near Jericho, Henyan, Untitled, and Göbekli Tepe, and another site I can't pronounce up there. But these sites are pre 9,500 years ago. So evolving civilization. These localities, as I say, each of these localities may have had the entire population of Britain contemporaneously in one locality. So if we're looking at the likes of Çatalhüyük, we're talking about 5,000 people living at this time, 9,000 years ago, which would mean the grand total of all the people living across the landmass of Britain. That's what we're talking about. And I know one of you is going to mention, but Carl, shut up, Mike. Haven't you been saying for a long time that the evolution of Western civilization seems to come in a British sense from the likes of Orkney, where in Orkney you get the first clay pottery, you get the first standing stone circles, you've got the first settlements. That completely is in opposition to what you're saying now. Are you saying that civilization came from this area, the east, went into Britain, and then somehow it got to Orkney, and then Orkney back into Britain? I'm actually probably saying this. I'm actually saying both. I'm saying that there are waves of people moving this sense of economy, this sense of the cereal crops, the ceramic culture, weaponry, and all the rest of it from the east into Western Europe. But I'm also saying that what's happening is in tandem, we're seeing an evolution of the things that I'm talking about from Orkney coming from the north as well. It's not called diffusionism, where everything comes from Egypt. It's actually called determinism. People decide to evolve with the way they evolve. This is what the human brain is. We're very curious. We're very curious. And one thing I'll chuck in there, it's very strange to me that the industrial revolution in Britain took the way it took. Nobody else was developing a train anywhere else on the planet, which is a bit weird, because the way Darwinism, in the way I look at it, sees that other people should be developing a train somewhere else on the planet. They would have, but we had the technology at the time. Somebody else would have developed the train in Japan a few decades later without any links with Britain. This is the way determinism works. Anyway, moving on without confusing you any further. I know you're confused, Mike, but don't be. Anyway, and the reason why I've got to mention you a lot, Mike, is that I'm not allowed to mention Ellen. You know, Ellen from the parties? I'm not allowed to mention her. I've got to mention you instead. Yeah, good. So I would like to, as we're getting into this, what I need to do is give you a couple more facts. Yeah. So Çatalhüyük, from what we've already said, could be classed as a Neolithic site, but it's not our Neolithic, because we don't go into the Neolithic until 6,250 years ago. They go into the Neolithic a lot earlier. And you know what? I don't like using these words Metholithic and Neolithic and Stone Age and Iron Age and Roman period, because they actually don't mean anything. And why? Because different parts of the world have a different Neolithic period. Different parts of the world have a Paleolithic period. Did you know there are people in Papua New Guinea still in a Paleolithic way of life? But we are in a modern way of life. So is it the modern world now? But it's not to people in Papua New Guinea. So what we could actually start saying is that these people, dates, we use dates. This is what we say. Something happened 8,000 years ago, but let's not say it's the Neolithic or Mesolithic period. I remember I was being, I think somebody said last week about the Neolithic period. They said, well, again, a certain woman who sat with Karen, and it's not Andrea. She said last week, well, hang on a minute, Neolithic, when you think about Karnak, means the beginning of agriculture. And I said, actually, no, it doesn't, because at Karnak, we've got the early evidence agriculture 7,500 years ago. And we've got cereals being planted. So therefore, they've got their Neolithic earlier. And stone circles are being erected in the Neolithic period. But it's 1,000 years before our Neolithic period. Do you see where it gets confusing? So let's not use the word Neolithic. So next point. Goff is completely confused now. No, he's not. Excavations really began at this site in 1961, 1965 by the archaeologist James Mellart. Now, this archaeologist had a few problems with the Turkish authorities. Things were happening with the artifacts. He was asked to leave. The site was left to decay. And this is why we've seen some of the images, the image that we're seeing in front of us today without a roof on it. Shame. This is an advanced culture. That's what we'll call it. Forget the word Neolithic. It's an advanced world, an advanced people. But we'll try and keep away from the word civilization. Because as you know, from watching that Amazon program very recently, that new series on the Amazon, it will mention this is a civilized world. And you start to think, well, what about the people who are in the tropical rainforest today? They're civilized as well. Let's not use that word. So advanced culture. The earliest building, a period at Çatalhüyük, is tentatively dated to 8,700 years ago. But now we're also seeing other dates of 9,500 years ago. That was tentatively dated back then. That was dated in the 1960s, but we've put 1,000 years on that now. The inhabitants lived in rectangular mud brick houses, like the one you're seeing, probably entered from roof level, presumably by a wooden ladder. Now, we've got a reconstructed image that we're going to see that really put the cat amongst the pigeons on Tuesday, which I'm going to agree and disagree with at the same time. And what we've got a hearth and oven inside these buildings, and we've got evidence of hearths and ovens in them. And they've got platforms within these building shelves where they would sleep, sit, and work. Now, they didn't defecate inside their buildings. They took their defecations away. They took their fecal matter away. They took all their rubbish away. They were very clean people, like the Hittites that would come after them. Same area, it is. And a few other things as well. Moving on. Another bullet point fact. I know some of you are putting your bullet points on the paper. Fact. Edible grains and oil-producing seeds and nuts were extensively cultivated, and animal husbandry was probably practiced. Yes, it would have been practiced. So, very advanced. And when you think about it, they can't just start plowing fields and planting nothing. They can't start looking after animals just off the street, right? This has been tried and tested. This has been going on for thousands of years before these people built these sites. Excavations of another area of it show shrines within houses and buildings. Does this indicate a religious quarter, or does it indicate people like their art? And one thing that could be said is the art that you've already seen looks rather Paleolithic, but people liked it. But then again, you could say at some other sites, this type of art could be repeated elsewhere and could be seen as any period. You know, we talk about the arts and crafts period in some of these worlds thousands of years before we get an arts and crafts period. Art itself is in the eye of the beholder, as we've mentioned many, many times in the past. Now, I've got another nice little article which I would like to read out to you. And it's quite extensive. So what we're going to do, I'm going to look at a few more images. And I'm going to read out this other article. And this article was printed in 2011 in World Current Archaeology. It's entitled Turkey Neolithic Life at Çatalhüyük. And this gives a bit more of an update to the other piece that I've just mentioned. So, sometimes assessing human impact on the environment. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So let's look at these images again. If we go back, we see where we are. We see this almost Paleolithic art, but this is what they liked. And we see these buildings excavated in the 1960s. Now, radiocarbon dates. Love it, don't we? Now, these are radiocarbon dates that have been that have been brought to us over the past 6, 7, like 10 years. So this is all relatively new. The site of Çatalhüyük is divided into two zones: the western mound and the eastern mound. And one thing I want to chuck in there is that we've got one image and I didn't manage to track that down, but there's one image that you can actually see on the internet of a map dating back nearly 9,000 years ago. So these people actually produced maps well before maps were ever produced. Eat your heart out, the Romans. These actually produced maps. So, okay, let's look at these radiocarbon dates. Let's look at the Oxford dates, the Oxford Ashmolean dates. The OX and the P and the AA all relate to laboratories in the PL. So the Oxford dates themselves. So what you need to do on these BCE dates, you need to add 2 onto the 7. So if you look, the earliest radiocarbon dates that they're actually getting are 9,269 years ago. So you see this on the side, 187 years. This is 187 years plus or minus that date. So this date could be in excess of 9,500 years ago, where we get some of the earliest evidence at Çatalhüyük. But it doesn't mean to say it's the earliest evidence of anything at the site, because we might actually have much earlier evidence somewhere that we haven't actually excavated. And look at all these other dates here. We're not going to go through every single one. But this date down at the bottom, which if you add 2 onto it, so here's my maths, 8939, forget this on the side, so 8939, and PL, that might actually stand for Pennsylvania. I haven't actually looked at that one, but what they do, when you get radiocarbon dates, what you do, you send a load of samples to Oxford, Pennsylvania. You might send some to the Hamburg University, or you might send these samples all the way around the world. And it means that the scientists are isolated from each other, and the contaminations, whatever. And what you do, you get all these different dates. So the more recent date is down at the bottom, and then the oldest date is 9,269 years ago. And it's great to actually have a radiocarbon date plethora like this. Mike, what does that look like to you? Does that look like a good reconstruction of those buildings that if we go back again, Mike, if we go to there, right, this is what the archaeologists are seeing, right? So what we then do, if we go to there, yeah, but does that look like a good reconstruction?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Mike's happy with that one. It looks like a proper Cretan village, exactly. But there's one difference. There are no streets between these. And what we do with the Çatalhüyük site, and there are other sites like this, is that were all these houses on the same level? Now, if they were all on the same level, the only light that you could have would be from a hatch in the roof. But if you tweak it a little bit, and you have some buildings higher than others, so you can have light coming in, and then you have a little hood on there and light coming in, you might be able to have a little doorway on the side, and you might be able to have layers. This is what some archaeologists think that the model, the original Çatalhüyük site, used to look like. We don't have much evidence to tell us what the roof levels look like, but I think some of those on Tuesday were up in uproar. They said, "Oh, this is nonsense. How can you move around the tops of the buildings when they go up and down?" And it might think that some buildings might have been more important than others because some stood up like this and others were down lower and all the rest of it. And they were all linked together on one sort of ground level. And I'm thinking, well, that's you thinking. That's what you think. That's what you think. You're not. Back in the past, the sense of being above somebody and down below somebody might mean something different to them. And obviously, and there's one thing that I was thinking of, and this is a really interesting point, Mike. If you have a hood on the roof that is flush with the roof, a trap door, if it rains, the water goes straight in, agreed? Yeah? So you can see, if you've got a little bit of a hood standing out and light can sort of go in and penetrate down below. So if we look at something like this, So you've got this little hood above, and the light can come in. You can still have light in, so you're not dependent upon this trap door. So when it rains, the rain is just going to go on the roof and is just going to sort of drain off. We've got evidence of drainage. The water is not going to go directly into the trap door because it's not flush with the roof, because the door is actually vertical rather than horizontal. And that's why we've got the reconstruction. And that's what I didn't say on Tuesday. And that's what I hadn't worked out on Tuesday. Now, one thing that I would say is it's such a bonus that you guys can do this on a Thursday. And why? Because you've got the hindsight of me working this out in the other lectures, like we've now done. Now, we do give a lot more detail. So what I'm going to do, I've got two things I'd like to read out, one after the break and one before the break. So if we can sort of look at a few of these images and go to there, and then I will give you what the first bit of notes. So you're looking at that, and what have we got archaeological evidence for? Now, I can tell you what we've got evidence for and what archaeologists have made up. Now, access into the roof levels, we don't really have that, but that's what I'm saying. And what we have archaeological evidence, watch the cursor. We've got evidence of these little ovens without flues. So that smoke's going to come back into the room and it's going to need an exit. We've got evidence of hard stands, raised up areas inside the building. We've also got evidence that people have been buried within the levels underneath. We've also got evidence of flooring. So we've got evidence of this. We've got evidence of sleeping material. We've also got evidence of timbers, which have collapsed. We've also got what's called Harris stratigraphic evidence. And what we mean by that is that when the people have abandoned the building, so when people have abandoned the building, you've got all the stuff on the ground, and this is this. So they've abandoned the building, right? This is the last phase of building. All this red stuff on the ground indicates bits and things that have been abandoned. Yeah, agreed? So when they've abandoned the building, the roof is still intact. So all of this information is evidence of when the people were last in the building and they didn't sweep and clean it out, because these people were very clean. So the evidence that we do have of the last people who lived in there are these red little things on the ground. And then eventually what's happened is that the roof has collapsed. So then you get the timbers above this, right? All these timbers above this. And what we then see is that we can determine how people lived by all the little things which are marked with red. So we can get an idea of Harris stratification. So we can get an idea of the reconstruction of the building. So much of what we do know about is actually preserved in the archaeology. And then what you've got all the other levels of crap that are built up on top of this. What is also interesting is that when people say this in the time that the site is last abandoned, right? They want to relive at this site. So what they do, they might actually backfill this with loads of crap, and they might create a new level with some of the old rotten timbers and so on. So all that evidence is useful for a sense of reconstruction with what we're looking at. And we've also got evidence of these. They actually loved their auroch and cattle heads. But actually this art on the wall, all of this is actually based on archaeological evidence. This is actually a bull's head with horns. There you go. Bull's head with horns. And you've got a stone pestle and mortar. And what we've got is evidence of their cereals and all the rest of it. All this has been excavated. This is what we see. Very, very important to these people at our site of Çatalhüyük. And those are the excavations of all the different layers of buildings. Notice a certain woman who's come on excavation projects with me, notice that they're all wearing hard hats, but none of them wearing high vis. Now, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, the layers of excavation there and what they've got, they're roofed it over. They've actually roofed this site over. It's enclosed. And also there's another advantage with having a site roofed over. Not only it protects the excavations, the light is the same light. I've worked on continental sites and you can't see what you're doing because everything's white because of the sun shining on the ground. Everything's white and all the layers, all the definition is the same. So it's really difficult to excavate. When you've got a roof over it, you're getting good definition in the excavation. So, and what you can do is look around these sites. Oh, and you can actually look into the excavations and look at the mud bricks and look at the archaeological evidence and things are being supported. Now, Mike, do you know what we could do with another cup of tea, couldn't we? Cheers, Mike. We could do this more often, Mike. We could have Michelle baking us some cakes. Yeah. We won't put on the public record what Michelle's cakes are like. Anyway, let's read out the following text. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read out this more or less this complete article from World Archaeology. So this gives us a bit of an update and we've got a little bit more information after the break. So sometimes accessing human impact on the environment can feel like a uniquely modern obsession, but it is not so. A great deal of research into, it's saying Neolithic archaeology, we're dropping that word today, is devoted to how people interacted with and adapted to their environment. Like today, understanding of how they managed animals and plants as food and fuel resources, or exploited the landscape for craft activities such as pottery production is key to our perceptions of any period. I'm ad-libbing on that bit. The ways in which archaeologists seek to answer these questions has become increasingly sophisticated. We've got advanced scientific techniques here, technology and thinking post-processionist archaeology, thinking outside the box, as I do most weeks. One relatively new approach known as microarchaeology combines a suite of microscopic and geochemical methods to examine archaeological deposits at a high resolution. So what we can do is look at sediment, look at how things change, look at where the water left the site, drainage, and more or less how they interacted every single day can be seen at a microscopic resolution at the lowest level. This enables clues about the past to be detected that were missed by traditional archaeological techniques because they are invisible to the naked eye. Now, somebody recently, it was Jane, was having work done on her property, and she was saying that nothing was found. But if you had microscopic resolution of that very minutiae of archaeological evidence, you may have actually found something. The prehistoric site of Çatalhüyük, located in the southern Anatolian region of Turkey, offers us an ideal case for addressing many questions that may assist us today. The site itself covers an area of 20 hectares. So in my language, times 2, 40, add 10, 50 acres in area. Now, anyone that's been to, now this is, I can give you an idea of the scale of this site. The site itself in area is the same scale, more or less precisely, as the Iron Age banked and ditched enclosure, otherwise hill fort, near Dorchester, known as Maiden Castle. That's how big this site is. And if not as raised at that height as well, with all the levels of evidence. The difference between this site and Maiden Castle is that most of the earthworks were done within a shorter period of time, and Maiden Castle dates very close to us in time compared to this site. Maiden Castle Most of the site dates to about 2,500 years ago. Most of the evidence of this site dates to about 9,000 years ago. Big difference, but the scale is the same. Now, what we do is we see a copious continuation. I use the word copious continuation for a reason of over 1,000 years. People live at this site for over 1,000 years. How did people manage to have that length of intercourse for over 1,000 years? How are they able to go into a civilized cultural exchange for over 1,000 years without killing each other? Living, women are a nightmare, folks. Living with a woman all your life is a nightmare, let alone living with other people for over 1,000 years. But this is what these people did. They lived in a community for over 1,000 years. And if we want to think, if we want to go and put some dates on this, 9,500 years ago to around 8,000 years ago, which is well over 1,000 years that people lived at the site. And you start to think, well, and the density of settlement has resulted in the site being stylized as one of the earliest urban centers in the world. And why not? Give them that title. Give them the title. Equally important, the preservation conditions at the site are unprecedented, resulting in a wealth of artifacts and materials that can be investigated using cutting-edge techniques. Do you know what? This tea is actually pretty good. Do you want to marry me, Mike?
No, thanks.
Oh, right. Thanks a lot. I'll have to put up with Michelle. I do love Michelle lots. She puts up with a lot of crap from me. So Çatalhüyük was only discovered in the 1950s. And you start to think, why is such an amazing site like this suddenly discovered? And it's been there and it's only just been discovered now. And Göbekli Tepe's only really just been discovered in terms of archaeological site discoveries. There are so many sites out there, and mark my words, particularly you, Keith, you cut things out of a newspaper. You, Keith, mark my words that maybe we will find another site like this is even older than Çatalhüyük. Mark my words, I am always right in regards to archaeology, but everything else I'm usually wrong. The magnificent paintings, artifacts uncovered, and we've got the mother goddess statue, the one behind me, this one. All of these are in pride of place within the heart of the Turkish mindset. And the site really, in many ways, this site has got international fame. We come across it quite a bit, actually. I mentioned Çatalhüyük. In other words, Çatalhüyük every couple of weeks because it's a really important site. I'll probably mention it as much as I mention Stonehenge. It's quality and quantity of artwork and it's the rare survival of such a sophisticated site. Emphasizes the existence of a thriving community subject to complex social organization without the bent of having kings and queens ruling over it. So I know Kathy's an ardent socialist. She will use this as an example to abolish the monarchy. They didn't need monarchy and they really didn't need religion to organize themselves. And this is what we see within the framework of research. So renewing the excavations to try and understand the excavations with modern techniques and ever-changing modern techniques are helping us understand this very complex agriculture and domesticated world. One thing that I actually very much said on Tuesday, I kept on making comparisons with the Yamon world. And when I kept on making comparisons with the Yamon world, I kept saying, for example, these people could have built something like this without the need of intense agriculture. They weren't involved in intense agriculture. In many ways, these were like the Yamon, are a high culture without going into, farming hundreds of acres of land to feed a population. They were able to hunt or gather, and they were able to have a little bit of agriculture, like the Yamon in many ways. And the Yamon were a very successful world for a very longer length of time than, for example, our people at Çatalhüyük. However, there's great parallels. The excavations have acquired an impressive reputation, and really since 1996, and some of the stuff in the 1960s have been groundbreaking, particularly since 1996, pioneering new scientific methods in archaeology and bringing together large numbers of specialists to ensure that the various different categories of archaeological evidence are fully integrated. Now, the one point is, it's such a large site. It's a bit for everybody. You can have German archaeologists, you can have American archaeologists, you can have British archaeologists, you can have archaeologists from Japan, you can have archaeologists from Turkey working there. It's great. All with their own little bit of science, because all of us archaeologists, as you know, you put two archaeologists in a room, both of us want to kill each other. So they're able to look at the archaeology and put their own hallmark on the archaeology, and it all comes together in one sort of academic scientific approach. This approach ensures that the maximum information can be harvested, evolved, disseminated, with looking at plant, animal remains, stone tools, pottery and human remains and so on, and how buildings are being constructed and how they lived and breathed. So in some ways, when you look at a site like this, you don't just have the bones, you actually have some of the flesh and the skin. You have a few more building blocks to how these people lived and worked, and the animal and the husbandry operated. Amongst the new techniques developed at the site is one called thin section micromorphology, originally devised to study soil formation processes. The technique has been applied by the University of Reading. Their goal is to seek out telltale indicators of activities at the sites which are preserved in the microscopic level. Teasing out such traces, however, is not straightforward, and blocks of archaeological sediment must be collected in the field before being analysed in situ in the laboratory. In order to achieve this, the blocks are set in resin. So what they're doing, they're finding areas which they need to take to the laboratory, and they're cutting blocks of archaeology out, sending them to the laboratory, and then they're being excavated and analysed in the laboratory. So there's no sense of contamination. In a sealed unit, in a laboratory, this is where the micro-excavated work is being done to decipher the microscopic signals for individual events. The one downside about these people is that they like to clean. So what we need to look at is the last layers of occupation, areas of buildings that have collapsed that may have preserved earlier phases. They've got over 18 phases at the site. Look at their cess, look at their drainage channels. That's what we're talking about. Examining floors, walls, everything. The tiny fragments of plants, bone, craft debris, and other materials are now being seen under the microscope. As some of you know, when you're napping flint or obsidian, I wouldn't nap obsidian because it's really health and safety. But when you're napping flint, what you do find is a pile of napped material, and you've got the core object, or you're going to use some of those napped materials and make tools. But what there's tiny little minutiae of slithers. And usually in the archaeological excavation, these little slithers are missed, but they're not being missed with this site. So what might happen, folks, is this. You've got a floor level. Bingo! It's swept clean by the people of Çatalhüyük. We've lost the evidence, but no, we haven't. Within those little cracks, little bits of flint may have ended up. And they swept it again, but those little bits of flint are still in there. Have you ever had that no matter how many times you brush a glass bottle you've just broken an hour earlier, you can't get every single fleck of glass? That's what we're talking about. There's a little bit of fleck of glass here and there, and those little minutiae of archaeological evidence that they're finding. When on the surface, we don't know that they knap flints inside these buildings. Under the surface, between the gaps, we can find those minutiae of glass. Where we might not know what they ate, a little bit of a grain or a little bit of pollen has made its way into the gaps between the bricks and the floor levels, and this is how we know what's going on. So even with today's society, forensic, if you want to kill somebody, right, as an archaeologist, I've always worked it out. If anyone ever broke into my house, I've got a procedure of dealing with their body. If anyone ever broke into my house, they wouldn't live. So I've got a procedure of how to dispose of the body. But I'm very knowledgeable in knowing that it would be very, very difficult to get rid of every speck of evidence. Being an archaeologist, I know that. I know how to dispose of a body, but it's very difficult to get rid of all the evidence of an individual. And this is what the archaeologists are finding when they're excavating a site like this. If they are able to detect minutiae, and this is why those microscopic signals help them understand past societies. Armed with such evidence, archaeologists are able to determine how space within buildings was used to a degree that would be impossible using more traditional methods. Even such everyday tasks as wall plastering can be appreciated in a new whole way. Layers, Mike. Layers upon layers can now be read. You see in one piece of art, and now you can use the microscopic analysis techniques that they've got to read the layers, as they're doing with scrolls that have been charcoaled from Herculaneum and Pompeii. They're able to read the scrolls without opening them. So these house-proud Neolithic occupants took pains to ensure that living areas remained clean and fresh by applying hundreds of coats of plaster, with a new layer being slapped on at approximately monthly intervals. Storage areas, however, were carefully tucked out of sight and thus treated accordingly. They have a rougher appearance due to part to being replastered once a year instead of every year, but the evidence is there. So I want to go on to my break, but I'm so keen on getting to the end of this bit. So I'm going to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the image again. Oh, yeah. Do we look at that? Do we look at that? Yeah, let's look at that. And then we'll go back. So rubbish archaeology. Examination of floor surfaces has revealed that the inhabitants of Çatalhüyük kept their buildings remarkably clean, as I've already said. Even under the microscopic traces of ash and dust are scarce and confined to specific areas within the building. But nevertheless, those bits of evidence have been found. Yet outside the buildings, there is a more heightened story. This is where they're putting all their crap. Within them, between clusters of buildings, are massive middens, which in places cover areas several meters wide. The stratigraphy of these middens is incredibly complex, and individual layers can be less than 1 millimeter thick. Each of these fine layers relates to a single activity, a single moment in time, a single postcard of the past, such as sweeping out hearth material, burning animal dung as fuel, or discarding broken basketry and matting. You could talk about malting as well. It is impossible to excavate such ephemeral layers in the field. So you've got to take a block of this out. You've got to look at it in the laboratory. You've got to gently take that millimeter away and define that that's 1 millimeter of archaeology. And then that's what you need to do. Can't do it in the field. You need to take it in the laboratory. Middens are generally described in archaeological literature as rubbish heaps. But a person's rubbish is another person's gold. These people living at Çatalhüyük had a different view of their rubbish, recognizing that they were a useful resource in their own right. The Çatalhüyük middens were routinely quarried to create level surfaces for new buildings, or to provide packing material between walls. They, as we see in the medieval period, the village reeve would have everybody's shit piled up in his yard, and then he would know to sell that back to you to spread on your fields. These people knew the value of crap. The surface of the middens themselves were often seen as a conventional site to have a fire, leaving them both pockmarked by numerous small pits and covered by deposits from bonfires. So they would routinely burn in these midden areas. Middens are particularly important at a site like Çatalhüyük because the inhabitants' desire to live in clean homes means that they are the best source of information on the daily life of the site's occupants, other than when you get those little bits of evidence that I've described. Microscopic scrutiny of midden matter has revealed a wide range of deposits. Although the majority is composed of ash and decayed organic material, the analysis of ash can yield a great deal of information about human activity. Deploying a combination of methods, including scanning electron microscopes, makes it possible to distinguish between different fuels. So instead of saying that just burn one type of tree, or they burnt this material, or they burnt this. So you're able to work out in every day what type of material they're burning. So in the winter, you might burn one type of plant material, or in another time of year, you might burn this, or you might burn this, or you might burn shells for this and that. They're able to work out what they're burning. So not only do we know that they're having fires, we're working out what materials they're using for those fires at different periods in time. Microscopic fragments or materials that were incinerated can be seen, including evidence from reeds and grasses, tiny charcoal fragments from wood, and particles, other particles which have telltale evidence they're actually burning animal dung as fuel. The varieties of fuels and their association with either hearths in buildings or bonfires in middens in turn gives a unique insight into the technological choices of these people. So what I'm going to do now is, I'm pretty knacked. So we're gonna stop the sharing, and we're gonna bring everybody on, and we're gonna start with Chris, the wonderful, sexy-looking female. Go on, Chris.
You just said just a thing about the figure behind you. Actually, what's to say that it's not a matriarchal society, and that's a queen sitting on her throne?
Actually, do you know what? Right, patriarchal's fine, right? But what we do see in the archaeological evidence is that men are the same status as females, and maybe you've actually answered it yourself. In a matriarchal world, this is what females would prefer, that everybody's equal. It's certainly in my world that I'd like to see people more equal in society. And obviously women are a lot more practical in that. Therefore, you've given a new interpretation of what's behind us. Yeah. It's a representation of a matriarchal society, not necessarily an earth goddess.
Yeah.
See, yes, horses for courses. Right, Jane, female.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? Absolutely gobsmacking just how sophisticated they all were so long ago.
Exactly, 100% there, 100%. Keith, not sure. Go on.
Did they find the site just by accident? Do you know?
Do you know what? I've been thinking that myself, and I would say, I would say you dig a mound. Most mounds across the plain of Anatolia are related to human evidence. So the answer is yes and no. So in other words, any mound that they dig into, they're going to come across with evidence.
Something.
End of.
And no staircases.
Yes. Ladders rather than staircases. Staircases would take up too much room in a building like this. That's basically it. Staircases take up space, so ladders. That they could build staircases easy. A block on top of a block, wonderful, but it takes up too much room. Ellen, female.
Right. You said about they didn't have the toiletry matter in the house. It was all taken away.
Yeah.
But a lot of people used to have either reeds or grasses as flooring or roofing. So if they had it as flooring, they used to let it all get filthy with all sorts of detritus, and then clear it all up and take it out and burn it. So is that what was being burnt on the midden?
Yeah, we've got evidence of that. We've got dung being burnt. I've said that we've got dung being burnt. The one thing about the one thing about human waste is that when it does dry out, it is actually a useful fuel.
Mm. But you said initially that they didn't have it in the house.
Well,
house.
Yeah. Well, basically, all of this is going into the middens. There's no evidence that they're defecating inside the buildings, and if you got some kind of spittoon, then why do you need to defecate in a building anyway? So obviously, if these people want to keep their houses clean, and then they're disposing of all this anyway, it's a bit like somebody being sick. You're sick all over your bed, and you're sick on your floor, and you're going to clean it up, but there's no evidence that you were ever sick. So that basically answers what's going on. And what we don't necessarily mean people in the past. if you've ever watched The Life of Grime, you will see people defecating inside their houses, toilets not working, and so on and so on. You see that, but we're living in a modern day society, so we don't get carte blanche on sanitation or not being sanitized. So yeah, we'll come in and out with that one. Does that answer your question?
I didn't know if it was like a communal loo, the midden.
It was for everybody.
Yeah.
Right, Goff, Mormon.
Yeah, Chris's argument about that the figure that you've got displayed behind you, but that female figure is ubiquitous all over the world, isn't it? So it's not a particular person. It's Mother Earth, and it's in all cultures.
But the other thing as well is, I agree with you completely, but does it need to have a religious connotation?
Oh no, I'm not necessarily.
Yeah, okay, yeah, okay.
And I got no questions, but I just want to say how pleased I am that you and Mike are enjoying your new life together.
3 M's. 2 M's.
Mike, you've now got a reputation now, Mike. That's a shame, really, Mike. You were such a manly individual once. Chris, male.
You know that archaeologist Hodder that you mentioned?
Yes, Professor Hodder, yeah.
I mean, did he come to any conclusions as to how the sort of society organised itself insofar as building cities like this or townships? I mean,
well, is that yeah? Carry on.
I mean, it must have expanded from a small unit to a larger unit. I mean, was there any indications as to whether that was done at random or just? There is a simple answer to that. We've already done it in the past. When we've looked at the causewayed enclosure, where you've got a group of people in a community in the Neolithic period in Britain, and each of them have got a ditch, and that's their family ditch, and they basically create a concentric ring of ditches with a space. Each of that was a part of the community landscape. Each of these people went off and farmed their landscape. There wasn't enough people to have a system of religious control. There wasn't enough people to have a patriarchal system of control. There wasn't any sense of system, because these people are just wanting to get together occasionally in a community, right? And when you look at the way that interacts, there's no reason to say that these people didn't come together and say, why don't we just build a building here alongside your building? And actually, when my ex-wife, mother living in Cardiff, in Alexander Road in Cardiff, she would say that her family actually built that house, and then the neighbour actually built their house. And then you look into streets in Barry, for example, somebody might build a few houses, and somebody else might build another few houses. And they would basically, everyone would agree that they'd all have to build them a similar style. But when you look at that, it's almost as if what you're seeing here, people build houses because they've got to build houses, but they build them. And that's the point. There's nobody controlling the specifics of the building. They've just got to build it in a certain way. And this is what we're looking at with this type of site. Yeah, fair enough, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Sewer. Do you want to say anything, Sewer? No, she's not saying anything.
She's muted.
She's muted.
I thought that I'd rather like a little holiday there. It looked very peaceful, and I like the simplicity. That's my only little statement.
Can I just say something? There is somebody who will be given a whole series of seminars. She's called Jessica, so she'll be the first employed person for Archaeology Virtual Online, and she'll be given a whole course of unusual areas in archaeology. And you never know, you might turn around and she might take you on a trip to Turkey. You never know. And I'll say that Sue wants to be one of those with you. She'll be your bag lady. So talking about bag ladies, Kathy, I want to break. Andrea, I want to break. Jim and Karen, Anything you want to say? No? 3. Oh.
No, we're all right. Oh, you can.
Didn't think that of you, Kathy.
And we thought she was a lady.
Nobody ever said you presumed she was a lady. I never said she was a lady. And to be honest with you, I know that peeking in through Kathy's keyhole when she stays, she looks a bit like this. Kathy, anything you want to say quickly?
Pronunciations.
Yeah.
We've done Çatalhüyük.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you use it then?
I'm just doing it to wind you up. Okay, we'll have a break now, right? And we'll have a shorter break today to try and catch up on some time. 5-minute break rather than 15. Go on, folks, hurry up.
You can't make it. Can't make it coffee.
Hurry up, you old witch.
No, let's not have the barking and the woofing. You got your mic. Oh, yeah. Something to look forward to, Chris. This Saturday, between 4 and 7 p.m, there's an open top bus tour of Llantwit and Boverton of the RAF St Athan Voluntary Band.
Oh,
So that's fantastic, isn't it?
yeah.
It starts at the rugby club at 4 p.m, and then moving up to the post office, down Stalcourt Avenue, Ham Lane.
Oh, it'll be coming past me.
Yes, this is all done for you. Stopping off at Ham Manor, and then outside the Roman Catholic Church, and then it goes on to Boverton Brook, Treberid. It's a mobile carol service. Eagleswell Road, Monmouth Way.
Disgusting.
Okay,
Yes.
let's carry on.
Horrible.
Are we seeing these images now, Goff, darling?
Yes.
Right, good, good. It's good to hear your voice. I
Good.
always like hearing your voice.
Yes, that's good. Where's
Uh,
Mike?
No, he's
Is he? Oh.
oh, God. No, Mike's just had to go and get the bus. So he,
How are
he
you calling?
did ask whether he should do Thursday mornings or Tuesdays, and I said no, Mike. You got to stick to a Tuesday. Our time together has to be mano on mano.
All right, get on with it.
I tell you what, sometimes I get the blame for everything. You're the one who started the conversation. Death and
We
diet.
understand your needs.
Much of the organic material in middens can be identified as human and animal coprolites. And that's we were talking about fecal matter before the break. Species are rarely the first thing people think of as important archaeological finds, but they provide a key source of information about diet and health, particularly diet. Your stools can contain worms and all sorts of eggs and things, and obviously down through your dietary tract, certain meats are not digested. This is why pigs like to eat human fecal matter, and we can work out lots of things by examining fecal matter. The sheer volume of such material at Çatalhüyük and is an excellent resource. It's excellently preserved, provides an important complement to other indicators of diet such as animal bones and plants and so on. It can be difficult to decide what species coprolites, what species are found in the coprolites, but because of the microscopic way we're doing analysis now, we can get a full idea of what they're eating. And also in regards to dishes, I'm going to chuck this in there as well. When we look at the evidence from the Hittite kingdom many years later, we actually see bowls with meals that have obviously congealed and all the rest of it. But by looking at the microscopic evidence, we can work out what ingredients were being put in there and how food was being prepared, at what temperature food was being cooked and all the rest of it. And from human coprolites, you can actually get that similar level of archaeological evidence to work out what particular meals that person was eating that day. So it's no longer reliant upon seeds and bone evidence. It's reliant upon lots of other indicators that we can see through fecal matter by looking at bile acids in the gut, distinguishing other bits of information. And the bile acids can also determine whether the stool is actually coming from a human or any other vertebrate. Under the microscope, tiny inclusions in coprolites can be seen at the plant and bone. Even what we do see in coprolites is we do actually find little fragments of bone as well. So they actually go through the dietary tract. Cereal husks. They've got lots of evidence that one of their favorite digestions was a hawkberry. Hawkberries, they like their hawkberries. Parasitic eggs, we've mentioned all that, clues to health. Microscopic and chemical techniques can also be applied to other contents. We have, for instance, often wondered whether plants and animal products were included as grave goods at Çatalhüyük, grave goods within the buildings themselves. So by looking at traces, we can work out if people were actually buried with foodstuffs. In the excavations in the 1950s, it was just a hypothesis. They find a body. Was it buried with something? They didn't know in the 1960s. Now, the analysis of chemical residues from these deposits, they call them yellow deposits. They've got these yellowy deposits in regards to the human skeletons, which they've long sort of thought that might actually be indicators of that they're being buried with something. So plants, sterols, which are the indicators associated with plants, a bit like their acids, are actually being found associated with the burials. They're being buried with maybe flowers or other things to take into the afterlife. The silicates associated with plants have also been found associated with burials. Tissues and cells all being indicated, not all decayed. And even what they're finding through microscopic analysis is that they're finding tiny decaying organic components associated. When they actually find evidence of mats and baskets and so on, that there are little organic residues of some of the plants and some of the fauna as well. So it's just, words can't say the amount of evidence they're finding. So in sort of conclusion to this little bit and going on to some images and then we'll get to the end. The use of these microscopic techniques is, amazingly enough, is still in its infancy. So if they're saying they found all this at this stage, what more could they actually find over the next few years? This is, again, still in its infancy. So I've told you so much already. For the time being, only for the time being, they have provided us a unique glimpse of a population that can that had cleanly areas. They feasted on a variety of wild cultural foods. They mourned their dead and put flowers with them, and they recycled their organic waste. Many aspects of their lifestyle of these urban inhabitants are still familiar in our own more city-centric world. It is a reminder that sometimes the most important archaeological discoveries are neither beautiful nor visible, but it tells us of a people that could be said to be very similar to us today, who maybe if they went out and voted in a US election, it would have been fair and just. That's just to wind you all up. So let's look again at these images. We've seen inside the building, we looked at the archaeological evidence for that, the depths of the archaeology, and again, more of the survival. We've already seen this, and you can get an idea that there's different phases, 18 different phases of building here. And this is where you can actually go and have a look at the site. And I'm just being distracted by something on the left-hand side of the screen, and it looks like steps, but they look like fairly modern steps, to be honest, alongside concrete steps. I'm not really sure what's going on there, but obviously this is the display area. And look at this, the earliest known flax textile fragments, fabrics perhaps used to wrap the dead. They were carbonized in a fire and radiocarbon dated to 8,000 years ago. Textiles. So the list of what we're finding from the site and understanding from the site is second to none. And actually, I'm going to say it, right? This is Chris's fault, your fault. Matriarchal society, right? Maybe what we could find in future generations, the only people who are able to touch this could have been women. We might be able to actually find DNA, female or male DNA on this. We might actually find that there were libations poured on this statue. We will find evidence of that. We might find, for example, that the process of veneration for this statue was to kiss it or to lick it. And I'm not, no jokes aside, all that's going to come. If they're at this level of microscopic technology, they'll be able to work out what that's all about. And they'll even be able to work out who was wrapped in this textile. If it was an item of clothing or it was to put a burial, we'll be able to get that, and all that's coming. I chucked these in. This is actually this is actually from a settlement which was near Çatalhüyük. And these actually date from no more than 3,000 years ago. So these are actually pretty young. But when the site of Çatalhüyük was abandoned, there were probably people living in and around the landscape, even as they are today. The Çatalhüyük bull's heads. And I think these might actually be pseudo reconstructed examples. They might be the original. I can't imagine they would mount these on the wall if they were the original. But these are the ones in the ground. So what I would like to do now is Çatalhüyük itself, a few keynote bits of information. The site itself is a World Heritage Site. It was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2012, July, as late as that. So we see it really flourishing in these notes around 9,000 years ago. So the dates go back and forth. Within that mindset of 9.5 to 9.5 to what were we saying about 6.5 or whatever, the dates range, it's really moving around 7.5, so 9.5 to about 7.5. So the dates move around from when the site was occupied, but at least for about 1,000 years. It overlooks you can see what's referred to as Mount Hassan in distance, the twin cone volcano of Mount Hassan, and actually portrayed on the wall of one of the buildings, one of the pieces of art is actually the twin cone volcano. So this art dates to 9,000 years ago, with a little bit of an indication of a plane, the first indication of an early map of a landscape 9,000 years ago. Absolutely great. So when we started looking at these 18 layers, and this was understood by James Mallat in the 1960s, 1961 to 1965, the excavations were stopped after Mallat was banned from Turkey for his involvement in the Dorak affair, in which he published drawings of supposedly important Bronze Age artifacts that went missing.
Naughty.
So if you want to look this up, it's known as the Dorak affair. We won't go into that D-O-R-A-K affair and see what we can see about that. The site basically lay idle until it was looked at in 1993, re-engaged with the archaeology in 1996 with them, other eminent archaeologists such as Lord Colin Renfrew. So Çatalhüyük, if you want to give a brief description, is a collection of domestic buildings. And we've got, in lots of them, we've got murals, and the population of Çatalhüyük is believed to have been, at some estimates, about 10,000, which is a hell of a lot of people for then, and close proximation, probably a lot of people for now. So 10,000 people is more people than actually live in Lantwick Major today. So put everybody in Lantwick Major. Imagine living with Kathy next door to you. Oh my dearie me. So the other estimate is around 5,000 people living within this wonderful community, family landscape. So this isn't the only site. There are other sites. So basically, Çatalhüyük is two main sites. There's Western Hill and Eastern Hill. And an archaeologist, I think Hod has suggested that on the people from Eastern Hill and the people from Western Hill at Çatalhüyük exchange trade and help and married people off. That's sort of an idea, but they're sort of, it may sound that they're all crammed into these mud brick houses, but they're sort of clustered into honeycomb mazes of buildings which were accessed along the roof line. Effectively, the roof line were the streets. So all the gases and everything escaped through the trapdoors that were the roofs, that we said, sort of, rather than horizontal trapdoors, having vertical trapdoors. Typically, houses contain 2 rooms for everyday activity, such as cooking and crafting and sleeping, and maybe ancillary rooms as things developed. And again, we keep mentioning the rooms were scrupulously cleaned by these people in the past, but we've got the large middens that we've actually talked about. And it's actually some talk about some of the buildings that might have actually been completely adjoined, and they were big enough that may have actually been plazas where the community may have actually met on the roofs to discuss what's going on. So we can sort of glean all this from what we're looking at. As part of this life, if you want to call it ritualistic, they used to bury their dead within the village, within the buildings themselves, which we actually see in lots of other cultures. It's perfectly acceptable in Central America. Human remains have been found in pits beneath the floors of the buildings that lived in, beneath halves. Beneath halves, interestingly enough. So the platforms within the main rooms may have been seen as beds. Bodies were tightly flexed before burial and were often placed in baskets or wound into or wrapped into reed mats and buried within these rooms. There is other talk that they may have actually exposed their bodies in one or two cases, that they may actually had a process of excarnation or sky burial. So the burials would have been exposed, bones collected together, put in a basket, buried inside the building. That's what we're also seeing. And what they're seeing is that there's different levels of what people are actually buried with. That there's a sense of status. There's a sense of equality in diet. Looking at bones, we've got an equality of diet. So the women bone growth and the teeth are as good as male bone growth and teeth. So the diet's the same. And actually, as the diet's the same across the board, there's no indication of aristocracy or great wealth. In many ways, you could probably talk about there may have been a village munkta that may have been elected every year. And that munkta may have been male or female. In Chris's eyes, definitely female. Yes, but I, to be honest with you, I don't go much for matriarchal and patriarchal society. For me personally, I know it may sound naive, and I might be sometimes derogatory towards women occasionally, which I apologize for, but in my own mind, men and women in modern society are equal. And when I look at archaeology, I like to see this, but I don't see it in lots of cases. But in regards to this, we see a great sense of equality. But we do see these distinctive female figures rather than male figures distinctively when we look at this. So there's no temples identified. There might be household shrines, which might indicate personal religion within homes that we see in some levels of Roman society, household gods or something like that, if you want to call them gods. What the things that they like to paint for were for predominantly hunting scenes, red images of now extinct aurochs and stags, vultures swooping down on headless figures. That might indicate the excarnation sky burial type of thing. You got lots of lionesses, and occasionally, even though you don't see statuary of men, you see men painted with huge erect penises painted on people's walls. So that's where the men are going. They're being painted onto walls. Heads of animals, especially of cattle, like the one in front of you, might be placed into paintings on the wall or mounted on the walls, or actually on the floor, like we're actually looking at. And we've got a painting of the Hassan Dag, the volcanic range, about 100 odd miles away, plus. And we see a representation of this. Some people think that this is an interpretation of an early map or a landscape. Others have actually given other ideas of what this might all mean. So I think the most important thing, and actually I've got a whole range of information that we could talk about that might be seen to be religion, but we've already discounted religion over and over again. But if we want to look at pseudo-religion and try and indicate what could be going on in their heads and not set state religion what we got today, I think it might be helpful if I read this out and you can make up your own mind, so it's not completely biased. The archaeologist, Professor Hodder, instead of talking about a mother goddess culture, Hodder points out that the site gives little indication of a matriarchal or patriarchal society. This is in my view, it's his view. There are full breasts on which the hands rest, and the stomach is extended in the central part. There is a hole in the top of the head which is missing, As one turns the figure around, one notices that the arms are very thin. And then on the back of the figurine, one sees a depiction of either a skeleton or the bones of a very thin and depleted human. The ribs and vertebrae are clear, as are the scapula and the main vertebral bones. The figure can be interpreted in a number of ways. As a woman turning into an ancestor, as a woman associated with death, or as death and life conjoined. It is possible that the lines around the body represent wrapping rather than ribs. Whatever the specific interpretation, this is a unique piece that may force us to change our views of Çatalhüyük society and imaginary. Perhaps the importance of female imagery was related to some specific role of the female in relation to death, as much as to the roles of mother and nurturer. So that doesn't help us any further, does it? Really doesn't. But we could go on a little bit more and look at this, but I don't wish to. I think we need to stick with what we've got and allow that to flow and have some meaning and whatever I'm talking about. So at the end of this, we've got a nice little bit of information, and look at these images. So again, bull's heads, auroch heads, and we're looking at a different society than ours today. Look at her. You know, I'd love to see the reverse of this as described. I've seen no illustration of the reverse. We're talking about the remains of a skeleton on the reverse of this or something. I can't see it. These little figures. Now, my description of this says, a twin goddess marble statue from Çatalhüyük dating back to 8,000 years ago. How the hell is it a goddess with two heads? We've got what seems to be a stamp seal or just an adornment for a ring. We've got obsidian mirrors from Çatalhüyük, again 8,000 years ago. And more of their painting. Look at that, a huge, actually look, it looks more like a moose rather than an auroch, but an auroch would have had huge horns, and that is really lifelike, I've got to say it. And you've got almost, it looks like cattle and hunting, and actually you've got several layers. You've got this darker figure here, which is probably in relation to this figure of the auroch, but the other one looked rather faded, not due to light being on them, but probably that they've actually come through the paint from an earlier impression. Look at that there. Now again, more of this as well. If we look at this as well, we can clearly see that that's the recent one, and that's probably recent, but these have almost been painted over, and you can see a figure interposed on this figure. So they're obviously whitewashing their walls on a regular basis, which we've already indicated in the way that they're treating their buildings. Going back to the original image that we saw at the beginning, and this, and that's me. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is talk quickly about trade. So if we go to this, an auroch head, and obviously through the art we can understand that their society a bit more, their economy. Çatalhüyük has strong evidence of an egalitarian society. I've forgotten the speech now. Sorry, Keith. You know the one I mean.
Egalitarian.
Yeah, that's the one. There's no houses which are distinctive. They're all very similar. The most recent excavations also reveal little social distinction based on gender, with men and women receiving equivalent nutrition and seem to have equal social status in life and death. Children observed domestic areas. I'm not sure what that means. They learned how to perform rituals and how to build or repair houses by watching the adults make statues, beads, and other objects. Absolute nonsense. How do they know that? Probably because the bones of children are all very similar in a burial context, so they were doing similar things in life as everybody else. So it might be that we might be seeing Çatalhüyük as some kind of close kin of a people evolving into a very big community, say divided into two groups, one eastern side of Çatalhüyük, western side if you want to look at something like Maiden Castle, one side of Maiden Castle, and the other side of Maiden Castle, one group of people, another group of people, maybe something like that. It's nothing like that at Maiden Castle, but that gives you an idea of scale. These may have actually been two kin social groups very much into creating similarity in two different zones associated with Çatalhüyük. In upper levels of the site, it becomes apparent that the people of Çatalhüyük were gaining skills in agriculture and domestication of animals. Female figures have been found within bins used for storage of cereals, such as wheat and barley, and the figurines are presumed to be a deity to protecting the grain, or equally, the statue may have just indicated that that belonged to a certain person. Peas were being grown, almonds, pistachios. This sounds like a good diet. Fruit from trees, that also sounds good. Sheep, cattle are being domesticated. Hunting for various sources, whether it's flora or fauna. Hunter-gatherer. Pottery and obsidian tools extensively being traded and worked throughout this whole area. Shells and flint, for example, from Syria. Trade. And this one. I usually get this question about why is there never a lead age? There's an answer here. There is also evidence that the settlement was the first place in the world to mine and smelt metal in the form of lead. So there's a lead age. But as I said, these ages really basically mean nothing. But we've got evidence of lead being refined. It's great. We've got a lead age. So when we look at about all this, there's lots of talk about this is an egalitarian society. But finally, one archaeologist argues that Çatalhüyük is more complex than I'm making out. This is in a paper in 2014. And that while there seemed to have been an egalitarian distribution of cooking tools and some stone tools, unbroken quernstones and storage units were more unevenly distributed. But then again, if you've got one quernstone and in one building and not in the other might have been for the extension of the family. Private property existed, but shared tools also existed. What the hell does that mean? It was also suggested that Çatalhüyük was slowly becoming less egalitarian, which I would probably go with, as society evolves to keep in with the Joneses, with greater intergenerational wealth transmission, though there may have been efforts to try to stop this. So whatever that means, again, I think what's being said is that eventually leaders will evolve. Site was abandoned, and then we start to see civilizations a few thousand years later in Mesopotamia and Egypt. On that note, that's the end of this today. I would like to ask folks, are there any questionos, darlings? Chris, Manolo. Okay, then I'll do Chris Fem. Chris?
No, thanks, Carl. That was very interesting.
Chris Mano.
No questions for me. Really good lecture.
Goff fallen asleep. Goff has fallen asleep.
Bless him. Had a hard night.
Ellen.
Yes, two questions. One, I always thought that oryx had that yoke coming down from their lower neck, and none of those creatures seem to have it. And
like a bib.
Yeah. And two, you know that statue, well, that model of a woman, the very large woman, and you said round the back there was a skeleton on her back.
So they're saying, yeah.
Yeah, well, they always say that inside every fat woman, there's a thin woman wanting to come out.
Right, okay, then on that note, thank you. Goff, anything you'd like to say, darling?
No, it's very interesting. I expect we'll be hearing more from that site in the future.
Yes, we will. And next week's lecture will be looking at China. There you go. Keith, anything? Keith and Ellen, stay behind at the end. Anything? Keith?
Got 10,000 people there living at its height and very hot temperatures in Turkey. Where are they getting all their water from?
They obviously got it from somewhere, and that's the only answer. The landscape would have been very different back there, more trees. But yeah, water's something that hasn't been mentioned, but definitely we'll no doubt get the answer. If water's coming directly from the roof into the buildings, the thing would be soon washed away. So obviously water must be being stored. So
Carl?
Yeah.
That place is Çatalhüyük, is it? Well,
yeah.
In Arabic, Çatal means river of, so there must be a river close to it.
Ah.
Well, there's the answer, Keith. That wasn't in any of my notes.
Well, the Çatal Arab is the Euphrates.
Ah.
Thank you, Shuttle Arab. And obviously you sailed down there, yes.
Many
Super.
times.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes.
That's really useful. Thank you. Very appreciate the shuttle. Yeah, thank you, Waterway. Sue, anything, darling? No? Okay. And finally, guys, before we finish now, Andrea, Kathy, whoever else is there, anything you would like to say?
One thing, is it on mute?
Yeah, no,
Can
it's
you hear
on
me?
mute, yeah.
Yep. Did they find any lead implements or anything made from lead?
Well, obviously, we've got evidence that they're smelting lead, so obviously the answer is going to be yes, but I've got no direct examples. So, anyone else from Karen's house?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So what I'm going to say is that we know what to do next week. I really appreciate your patience today. That was a really good one. I'm going to mention that we got a trip to October. We got a trip in October to Chester. If anyone's interested, ask me about that. So if there's no more questions today, David, Keith, and Ellen, and if there's no more questions, I'm going to thank you all. Chris, Goff, Jim, Kathy,
Bye-bye.
and I've missed out. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording a minute. So right, so you lot chat amongst yourselves a minute. I'm going to stop recording.